During the 1960s, one thing that many people could agree on was that they opposed the Vietnam War. This entire conflict was also known as the First Television War, due to the frequent filming in Vietnam, which was then flown to Tokyo to be developed and edited, before being transported to the United States to be aired on cable television. When footage from World War II surfaced, the camera crews remained outside combat zones to show the sides of the war that weren't as grim. Instead, a more uplifting perspective was shown, giving people high morale about the war. These stories were shown in movie theaters, and newscasters almost exclusively shared the good news. However, the Vietnam War was totally different in the filming aspect. This was the first time that people in the US could sit in their homes and see what was currently happening in the conflict, rather than seeing what happened after the fact. Along with this, more people were able to access video and audio broadcasts. From 1950 to 1966, the percentage of Americans who owned a television skyrocketed from 9% to 93% as televisions became essential for everyday life, in accordance with the popular opinion of the majority of the US citizens. Thanks to the First Amendment, which included the right to freedom of speech and also of press, along with other liberties, the media did not hold back on sharing their negative viewpoints on the Vietnam conflict. The media's viewpoint ended up turning to a more negative view after the Tet Offensive in 1968, which most saw as a defeat, along with the ability for Americans to see the war for what it truly was. They could also see the military abuses done, such as the My Lai massacre in 1968. This was where a company of American soldiers brutally killed unarmed women, children, and old men in the village of My Lai on March 16th, 1968. This sparked riots in colleges and cities across the entire United States. Now, the most important news reporter at the time was the anchor of CBS Evening News, Walter Cronkite. He was known as the most trusted man in America. Here's a clip from his February 1968 assessment of the war.
For it seems now more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate. But it is increasingly clear to this reporter that the only rational way out then will be to negotiate, not as victors, but as an honorable people who lived up to their pledge to defend democracy and did the best they could.
As a response to this, President Lyndon B. Johnson knew that something had to be done about the war. His words were, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." On April 1st, 1968, just one day after he announced he was not running for re-election, he stated, "As I sat in my office last evening, waiting to speak, I thought of the many times each week when television brings the war into the American home. No one can exactly say what effect those vivid scenes have on American opinion. Historians must only guess at the effect that television would have had during earlier conflicts on the future of this nation. During the Korean War, for example. At that time, when our forces were pushed back there to Pusan, or World War II, the Battle of the Bulge, or when our men were slugging it out in Europe, or when most of our Air Force was shot down that day in June 1942 off Australia. As a whole, the television coverage of the war, which was new to everyone at the time, fueled public outrage and anti-war protests. Television and the media as a whole ultimately led to having to make the decision to pull and withdraw US troops in 1973, completely eliminating the US with involvement in the war. These are the sources that I used to make this video. Thank you so much for listening.